Story number 1.
I had been working the graveyard shift at the small rundown gas station on the outskirts of town for nearly 6 months. The work was boring but manageable, and it paid the bills. Most of my shifts were uneventful, filled with the hum of the refrigerator, the faint glow of the neon lights, and the sound of my own footsteps echoing on the cracked linoleum floors. But one night, something happened that I still can't explain. It changed everything I thought I knew about the world, and I've never been able to shake the memory of that night. It started like any other shift. The evening air was thick with the promise of rain, though it hadn't started yet. The sky was dark, heavy with clouds that seemed to hang low in the air. The station was quiet, as usual. Only a few cars had passed through during the evening, and none of them stopped for gas. I was alone in the small store, the only light coming from the flickering overhead bulbs and the neon signs that buzzed faintly from outside. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the seconds dragging by. I was sitting behind the counter, chewing on a piece of gum, scrolling mindlessly through my phone when I heard the jingle of the door chimes. I looked up and saw a car pull in, a dusty sedan, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The engine sputtered, then went silent as the car coasted to a stop at one of the pumps. It was just after 2 a.m. I wasn't expecting much, just another late-night traveler or maybe a trucker passing through. But when the driver stepped out of the car, I froze. He was tall, thin, and disheveled, with wild, unkempt hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His face was pale, almost as if the life had been drained from it. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and seemed to be searching for something in the darkness. His movements were jerky and uncoordinated, like he was struggling to stay on his feet. The man walked slowly toward the door, his gaze fixed on the ground as he shuffled along. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about him felt off. It wasn't just his appearance. It was the way he moved, like he was being pulled by some invisible force. My heart skipped a beat, and an unease settled in my stomach. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound friendly. "Can I help you with something?" He didn't respond at first. He just stood there, staring at me blankly. His eyes flickered up for a moment, but there was no recognition in them, no sign of life. It was like he didn't even hear me. I cleared my throat. "Can I get you anything? Gas? Snacks?" Finally, he spoke, but his voice was strange, soft and raspy, as if he hadn't spoken in days. "I just need to use the bathroom," he said, his words barely audible. I nodded, pointing to the small restroom in the back. "Sure, right through there." He didn't acknowledge my gesture. Instead, he turned slowly and began to shuffle toward the back of the store, his footsteps dragging across the floor. I watched him go, feeling that same creeping sensation in my chest. It wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but something about him made my skin crawl. I tried to shake off the feeling, turning my attention back to the counter and my phone. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it. A low, guttural sound coming from the direction of the restroom. At first, I thought it was just the pipes or the building settling, but the sound came again, louder this time, a kind of raspy, wheezing cough. My heart started pounding. I stood up from behind the counter, instinctively walking toward the back of the store. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, and the light was on. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the door handle before I pushed it open. The man was standing in front of the mirror, his face turned toward it, staring blankly at his reflection. He wasn't moving. His eyes were wide open, but there was nothing in them, no recognition, no emotion. Just a hollow emptiness. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. Something was terribly wrong. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. His eyes didn't even shift to acknowledge me. I took a step closer, my pulse racing, trying to figure out what to do. Then, without warning, he turned sharply toward me, his body moving in a way that seemed unnatural, like it was too quick for a man his age and condition. "I'm sorry," I stammered. Are you all right?" He didn't speak. Instead, he reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered near my shoulder. I flinched, stepping back instinctively, but his fingers brushed against my skin. I don't know why, but I felt a sudden wave of coldness wash over me, like the temperature in the room had dropped by 10 degrees in an instant. His touch was ice cold, unnatural. Before I could pull away, his grip tightened and he yanked me toward him, His face came inches from mine, and I could smell something foul, like decay, like something that had been dead for too long. "Help me," he rasped, his voice barely audible but full of desperation. I tried to push him away, but my body felt heavy, like I was suddenly paralyzed. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The only thing I could do was stare into his empty, lifeless eyes as they seemed to stare right through me. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in that grip, but eventually he released me. I stumbled backward, gasping for air as I scrambled to get away from him. My heart was racing in my chest, my head spinning. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I ran back into the store, my mind a blur of confusion and fear. The man didn't follow me. He was still in the bathroom, just standing there, motionless. The door was still open, but I didn't dare go back. I didn't want to see what would happen next. I quickly grabbed my phone, preparing to call the police, but just as my finger hovered over the screen, I heard the front door open. I looked up, and there he was, walking out of the store, just like nothing had happened. He didn't even glance at me as he made his way toward his car, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. He got in, started the engine, and drove off into the darkness without a word. I stood there, frozen in place, trying to process what had just happened. I had been touched by something cold and lifeless. And yet, there was no explanation for it, no logical reason for any of it. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to think. After a few minutes, I managed to pull myself together. I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and sat down behind the counter, my hands still shaking. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream, that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew what I had felt. I knew what I had seen. And I knew that I would never be the same again. The rest of the shift passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. I kept glancing toward the door, expecting him to return, but he never did. When my shift finally ended, I walked out into the cold night, still feeling the lingering effects of that encounter. I drove home, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights following me. But when I got to my apartment, I felt a strange sense of relief. I was safe, for now. But every time I pass that gas station now, I can't help but wonder if something is still waiting there, waiting for the next person to come along. And the thought that it could be me again, that I might encounter whatever that thing was, well, it's something I try not to think about too much. But it lingers, the unease, the feeling that something is always watching, waiting just beyond the edges of the night. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was a cold and stormy night when it all began. I was alone in my old apartment, a place that had always felt a little eerie, even before the strange occurrences started. The apartment itself was relatively small, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of building that had seen better days, with peeling wallpaper and floors that creaked beneath your feet. But despite its age, it was affordable and convenient, and that was all that mattered to me at the time. I moved in a little over a year ago, after a difficult breakup. It seemed like the perfect place to start over, a new chapter, a fresh start. At first, everything was fine. The apartment felt safe, and I even grew fond of its quirks, the way the radiators would hiss and pop at night, the faint draft from the windows, and the occasional sound of footsteps from the floor above me, which I assumed were just my neighbors. But soon, things began to change. I can't pinpoint the exact moment when it started, but there was a shift. It was subtle at first. Little things that I brushed off. Objects would be out of place, a mug in the kitchen that I didn't remember using, a book slightly turned on the shelf. I told myself it was just my own forgetfulness, a result of stress or fatigue. But then it became harder to ignore. The first real sign that something was wrong happened on a rainy Friday night. I had just gotten home from work, exhausted and ready to relax. I locked the door behind me and went straight to the kitchen, hoping to make myself some dinner. As I walked past the living room, I noticed something strange. The hallway light, which I had turned off before leaving that morning, was on. I hesitated, standing in the doorway of the living room, my mind racing. It couldn't have been on when I left. I was sure of it. I had even checked the light switch before heading out that morning, a habit I had developed to ensure I wasn't wasting electricity. But now, there it was, shining brightly in the otherwise dark hallway. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I had simply forgotten. After all, I had a lot on my mind lately. But as I moved closer to the switch, I felt a strange chill in the air. It wasn't just the coolness of the evening, it was something deeper, something unsettling. I quickly turned the light off and went into the kitchen, determined to focus on my dinner. Later that evening, as I settled into the couch with a glass of wine and a movie, I began to feel like I wasn't alone. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination running wild. The apartment was small, after all, and every sound could be explained away by the creaks and groans of an old building. But as the night wore on, I began to hear things, whispers that seemed to come from the corners of the room. At first, they were so soft I thought I was imagining them, but as the night progressed, they became clearer. I would hear my name, faintly, as if someone was calling me from another room. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the wind or the house settling, but the unease was building. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. My pulse quickened and my body tensed, but I refused to give in to fear. I had always been skeptical about the supernatural, and I didn't want to let my imagination get the best of me. Then it happened again. As I was about to turn off the TV and head to bed, I heard it. This time, unmistakable. A loud, crashing sound came from the kitchen, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. My heart stopped. I sat frozen on the couch, staring in the direction of the kitchen. I couldn't move. It wasn't possible. No one was supposed to be here. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I slowly stood up and made my way to the kitchen. The lights were off, but I could still see the faint outline of everything in the dim moonlight streaming through the window. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed the floor. There, lying in the middle of the room, was a mug I had left out earlier. A mug that had been sitting on the counter, undisturbed, when I went to sit on the couch. It was shattered. Pieces of ceramic scattered across the floor, and next to it there was a faint damp stain on the carpet, like something had spilled. Something dark, almost like ink. My stomach turned. I had no explanation for what I was seeing. There was no wind, no drafts that could have caused the mug to fall, and no way that it could have just slipped off the counter on its own. I bent down to clean up the mess, but my hands were shaking so badly that it took longer than it should have. As I stood up, I felt a sudden weight on my chest, a feeling of pressure, as if someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. There was no one there. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. At that moment, I realized I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong, and I needed to figure out what was going on, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something kept me there, something that made me feel like I couldn't escape, like the apartment was holding me captive. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak, every groan of the building, every soft whisper in the dark kept me awake. I kept the lights on, but it didn't help. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, and I swore I saw figures moving just out of the corner of my eye. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't go back to that apartment until I figured out what was happening. I spent the day researching online, trying to find answers. There were so many theories: paranormal activity, ghosts, residual energy, haunted objects, but nothing seemed to explain it fully. I even called a friend who had experience with these things, someone who claimed to have seen and experienced things beyond the ordinary. She listened to my story patiently and told me that sometimes places can become haunted by the energy of the people who've lived there. Old houses, old apartments, she said. They carry the weight of everything that's happened inside them. I didn't know what to believe, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay there any longer. The fear was consuming me. That evening, I went to bed early, determined to get some rest. But just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it again, footsteps soft and deliberate, pacing back and forth just outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat up quickly, my eyes darting to the door. The footsteps stopped, and I held my breath, waiting for whatever would come next. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, The footsteps resumed, but now they were louder, closer. I felt a cold draft rush through the room, even though I knew the windows were closed. My body froze in place as the footsteps reached the doorway. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the door, throwing it open, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, silent. But then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, dark, and indistinct, like a silhouette. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't breathe. I stumbled backward, my body trembling. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I couldn't. That night, I packed a bag and left. I stayed at a friend's house for the next few weeks, too scared to go back. I told myself I would eventually face whatever was in that apartment, but I never did. It was like the place had its claws in me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me to return. Years later, I still don't know what happened that night. I can't explain the whispers, the footsteps, the figure at the end of the hallway. But one thing is for sure, there was something in that apartment, and whatever it was, it never wanted me there. Story. The end.
Story number 3.
The storm had come out of nowhere. David glanced at his fuel gauge, cursing under his breath. The needle hovered just above empty, and the heavy rain was making it almost impossible to see the road ahead. He had been driving for hours, exhausted from a long business trip, and now he was stranded on a deserted highway with no gas station in sight. His phone had lost service miles ago, and the only light came from the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the dense trees lining both sides of the road. The last sign he had passed said, Oak Hollow, 12 miles. He didn't remember ever hearing of the town, but he figured it was his best shot at finding a gas station. The road was narrow and winding, and the farther he drove, the thicker the fog became. It was the kind of fog that seemed unnatural, pressing against his windshield like a living thing. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel as a sense of unease settled in his chest. Then he saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road. David's heart skipped a beat. At first, he thought it was a hitchhiker, a young woman, drenched from the rain, wearing a pale blue dress that clung to her thin frame. Her long, dark hair covered most of her face, but he could tell she was staring at him. Something about her presence sent a chill through him. He slowed the car, but didn't stop. It wasn't safe to pick up strangers in the middle of nowhere, especially in a storm like this. But as he passed her, she did something that made his blood run cold. She smiled. Not a friendly smile, not one of relief. A slow, eerie stretch of lips, revealing teeth too sharp, too white against her pale skin. David's foot pressed instinctively on the gas, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He forced himself not to look in the rearview mirror, afraid of what he might see. The road stretched ahead, seemingly endless. Then the static started. The radio, which had been silent for most of the drive, crackled to life, faint at first, then growing louder. And then, through the noise, he heard it. A whisper. David. His hands turned ice cold on the wheel. He glanced at the radio, the screen flickering erratically. Then, movement. Out of the corner of his eye, in the rearview mirror, his stomach clenched. He didn't want to look. He knew deep down that if he turned his head, he would see her sitting in the back seat. But something compelled him. Slowly, his gaze flicked upward. The back seat was empty. For now. His pulse hammered in his ears. The rain pounded harder, the wind howling through the trees. He just needed to make it to Oak Hollow. He'd find a gas station, maybe a motel, get some rest. Then the headlights flickered. For a split second, darkness swallowed the road, and when the lights returned, she was standing in the middle of the road. David barely had time to react. He slammed the brakes, tires screeching against the wet pavement, but it was too late. His car plowed forward and went right through her. No impact, no sound. She simply disappeared. David sat frozen, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The road ahead was empty. Nothing but the fog and the rain. His body trembled as he forced himself to keep driving. His mind struggled for a rational explanation, but deep down, he knew. He wasn't alone. The radio static flared again. David, you can't leave. His heart seized in his chest. The voice was inside the car. A slow, chilling breath tickled the back of his neck. David's body locked up. He didn't turn around. He didn't move. Then, fingertips, cold as ice, brushed against his shoulder. That was it. He stomped on the gas pedal, his tires spinning against the slick road before catching traction. The car roared forward, speeding through the endless stretch of fog. His pulse pounded in his ears, his vision blurring. Then, just ahead, he saw lights. A sign. Welcome to Oak Hollow. Relief flooded through him. He had made it. The town was eerily quiet, the streets slick with rain. Dim streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across empty sidewalks. There were no people, no moving cars, and just rows of old buildings with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. David spotted a gas station up ahead. The lights were on, but it looked abandoned. He pulled in, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, catching his breath. Then he saw her again, standing just beyond the gas pumps. Her soaked dress clung to her frame, her hair plastered to her pale face, and that smile. David scrambled out of the car, his heart in his throat. The wind howled, but she didn't move. She just stared. Then she spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the storm like a knife. David took a shaky step back. Who are you?" She tilted her head as if considering his question. Then suddenly the gas station lights flickered, and the town changed. The buildings, once run down but intact, now looked burned and broken. The streetlights buzzed and dimmed. The air smelled of smoke and decay. David's breath hitched. The town wasn't abandoned, it was dead. His mind reeled, struggling to understand. He turned back toward his car, but it wasn't there. The gas station, the road, the town, everything around him shifted, twisted. And then he heard the whispers, a chorus of voices. "You can't leave." The girl stepped closer. Her smile widened. "This place," she whispered, "is where you died." David's blood ran cold. He took a stumbling step backward. No, I was just driving. I crashed." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had crashed. The storm, the woman in the road, the skidding tires, the impact. The memories slammed into him all at once. And then, like the flick of a switch, the rain stopped. The town was gone. David stood alone on the side of the road, staring at the twisted wreck of his car. The windshield was shattered, the front crumpled against a tree. Steam hissed from the hood, and inside, his own lifeless body sat slumped over the steering wheel. His mouth went dry. His legs trembled. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But as he turned away from the wreckage, he saw her, waiting for him, smiling. She reached out a pale hand and whispered, "You belong to us now." Darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, when the sun finally rose, a passing motorist spotted the wreckage. The authorities arrived within the hour. David's body was found inside the car. The cause of death, a fatal impact. But the strange thing was, despite the fresh crash, the coroner determined he had been dead for days. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The wind howled through the skeletal trees as James tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his fingers pale against the black leather. The road ahead stretched like a dark ribbon through the dense Virginia forest, the headlights of his old sedan barely cutting through the swirling mist. He glanced at the dashboard clock, 2:13 a.m. He should have been home hours ago. James had spent the evening drinking with a few coworkers, but now he regretted every drop. His head was still clouded, though not from alcohol. Something else gnawed at his nerves. The drive was uneventful at first, but as soon as he left the city limits, the fog had begun rolling in, thick and unnatural. His GPS signal had cut out, and his phone battery was dead. He was alone on the road, or at least that's what he thought. It started with the radio. A crackling, faint at first, then louder. The dial turned by itself, flipping through static-filled stations before settling on something. A whisper, soft and rhythmic, just beneath the distortion. "James," his breath hitched. He snapped the radio off, his pulse hammering. "Just my imagination," he muttered. But then he saw the woman. She stood at the edge of the road, pale and barefoot, dressed in a long white nightgown that fluttered despite the still air. Her dark hair fell over her face, obscuring her features. James's foot instinctively pressed the brake, tires screeching as he stopped inches from her. His heart pounded as he leaned forward, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. She didn't move. "Hey, are you okay?" he called, rolling down the window slightly. The woman remained still. James hesitated before unlocking the door and stepping out into the cold night air. "Miss, do you need help?" Still no answer. A shiver crept up his spine, but he ignored it, stepping cautiously toward her. Then she moved, a slow, jerky tilt of the head revealing her face. James stumbled backward, a gasp escaping his lips. Her eyes, solid black, void of any whites or irises, locked onto his, and her mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. The air around him grew heavy, suffocating. Then she took a step forward. James turned and ran. He barely made it back inside the car before slamming the door shut and jamming the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as he caught a glimpse of the woman crawling toward him on all fours, her limbs bending unnaturally. His foot slammed the gas pedal and the car lurched forward. The woman's figure vanished into the mist behind him, but the relief was short-lived. A few miles down the road, James glanced at his rearview mirror. She was in the back seat. His scream caught in his throat as the woman lunged forward, her icy fingers wrapping around his neck. The car swerved wildly, tires screeching on the pavement. James fought to keep control, but the pressure on his throat tightened. His vision blurred as he struggled for breath. With his last ounce of strength, he yanked the steering wheel to the side. The world flipped. A deafening crash. Then, silence. James woke to darkness. His body ached, his head pulsed with pain. He groaned, blinking through the haze. His car was upside down in a ditch, the windshield shattered, metal groaning in protest. But he was alive. Slowly, he turned his head. She was gone. A broken laugh bubbled from his lips. He wasn't sure if it was relief or hysteria. He fumbled for his phone, but it was still dead. His chest heaved as he forced himself to move, crawling through the shattered window onto the damp forest floor. The distant sound of sirens filled the air. He was safe. Or so he thought. James tried to stand but froze. Across the road, standing at the edge of the tree line, she was watching him. And this time she was smiling. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The road stretched endlessly through the dark countryside, the moon barely visible behind thick clouds. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the car tires against the asphalt. Jason drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, exhaustion settling into his bones. It was past 2 a.m., and he had been driving for hours, heading home from his grandmother's funeral in a small town upstate. The trip had been emotionally draining, and now all he wanted was to crawl into his bed. He checked his phone. No signal. Not surprising. This part of the state had spotty reception at best. He sighed and kept his eyes on the road. The highway was empty. No other cars, no houses, just endless stretches of farmland and forest. The further he drove, the more isolated he felt. The occasional road sign flashed past, but they became less frequent the deeper he went. And then he saw something. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of his eye, something pale at the side of the road. He frowned, gripping the wheel tighter. As he drew closer, his headlights illuminated a figure standing by the shoulder. A woman. She was barefoot, wearing a white dress that billowed slightly even though there was no wind. Her long, dark hair covered most of her face, but what Jason could see of her skin was unnaturally pale. His heart pounded. What the hell was she doing out here alone at this hour? Instinct told him to keep driving. The logical part of his mind screamed, "Don't stop!" But his conscience got the better of him. He slowed the car, rolling down his window just a crack. "Hey, do you need help?" The woman didn't move. "Miss?" No reaction. The eerie stillness made his skin crawl. Something was off. He knew it. Then, without warning, the woman's head snapped up. Jason flinched. Her face was ghastly white, bolisé, and her eyes, solid black like deep pools of ink, locked onto his. His breath hitched. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think, and then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, stretching unnaturally across her face. Jason felt his stomach twist with a primal fear he couldn't explain. The woman took a step forward. Jason slammed his foot on the gas, his tires screeching as the car lurched forward. His heart pounded in his chest as he sped down the road, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't dare look back. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. His pulse still raced, his breath shallow. He forced himself to calm down, to focus on the road. It was nothing, just some deranged person messing with travelers. But then, the whispering started. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the engine. A soft, rhythmic murmur, like someone was speaking just behind his ear. His stomach dropped. Jason glanced at the rearview mirror. She was in the back seat. His breath caught in his throat. She sat there completely still, her head slightly tilted. Her black eyes bore into him through the mirror. His mind screamed for him to move, but his body wouldn't respond. He was frozen, locked in place by sheer terror. Then she lunged forward. Jason screamed, jerking the wheel. The car veered off the road, skidding violently before crashing into a ditch. Pain exploded through his body as the airbags deployed, the sound of crunching metal ringing in his ears. Darkness crept at the edges of his vision, but he forced himself to stay conscious. His head throbbed, his limbs felt heavy, but he was alive. Slowly, he turned his head. The back seat was empty. A broken, nervous laugh escaped his lips. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the stress. He was in shock. But as he fumbled for his phone, a new sound sent ice through his veins, a soft tapping on the car window. His breath hitched. He turned his head, and there she was, standing outside the passenger window, grinning. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Jason didn't need to hear her. He knew what she was saying. "Let me in." His fingers fumbled for the door lock, making sure it was secure. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as she continued to tap, tap, tap on the glass, the sound slow and deliberate. Then her head began tilting to the side, farther and farther, until it was almost at an impossible angle. Jason couldn't breathe. Then she disappeared. No movement, no sound, just gone. Silence filled the air. The wind had stopped, the insects had stopped, the world itself had gone still. Jason forced himself to move, reaching for his phone again. Still dead. He had no choice but to get out. He needed to find help. The road was empty. His car was wrecked. There were no houses nearby. He had to walk. Heart hammering, he forced the door open, stepping onto the cold, damp grass. The air smelled heavy, like rain was coming. He glanced around. No sign of her. But he didn't trust it. He started walking. The road stretched before him, dark and endless. His footsteps felt too loud, each one echoing unnaturally in the night air. He kept glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see her standing in the distance, but there was nothing. Then he heard the whispering again. Jason broke into a run. He didn't care where he was going, he just had to get away. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he kept running. The whispering followed him, growing louder, closer. Then a pair of hands grabbed his shoulders. Jason screamed, twisting away, but there was nothing there. His vision blurred with panic. He had to keep moving. Then he saw the headlights. A car. A car was coming down the road. Relief flooded him. He stumbled forward, waving his arms frantically. The car slowed, its high beams blinding him. A man leaned out the window. "Jesus, buddy, are you okay?" Jason could barely speak. "Help me, please." The driver frowned. "What happened?" Jason turned to point down the road, but the road was empty. No wrecked car, no woman, no sign that anything had happened at all. The driver hesitated. "You need a ride?" Jason swallowed hard, nodding. He climbed into the passenger seat, his hands still trembling. The man pulled back onto the road, eyeing him cautiously. "You sure you're okay?" Jason hesitated. He glanced at the rearview mirror. For a moment, he thought he saw her face, grinning. He blinked. It was gone. Taking a shaky breath, he nodded. "Yeah, just drive." As the car disappeared into the night, a shadow stood at the edge of the road, watching, waiting, and smiling. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The road stretched ahead, an endless ribbon of darkness. Mark checked his phone again. Still no signal. The glowing numbers on the dashboard read 2:13 a.m. His headlights barely cut through the fog, rolling in from the dense forest on either side of the road. He had been driving for hours, making his way back from a work trip. The plan was simple: drive through the night, beat the morning traffic, and get home before sunrise. But the further he drove, the more the road seemed unfamiliar. His GPS had gone offline about 30 minutes ago. At first, he chalked it up to bad reception, but now a sick feeling was creeping into his stomach. He should have passed a town or a gas station by now. Instead, it felt like he was going in circles. Up ahead, the headlights caught something on the side of the road. A hitchhiker. A young woman standing still on the shoulder. Her clothes looked old-fashioned, like something from the 1950s. Pale blue dress, knee-length with a thin white belt. She was barefoot, her long dark hair falling over her face. She didn't move as he approached, didn't wave for help. Mark's fingers tightened around the wheel. Something about her presence unsettled him. He wasn't the type to pick up strangers, especially not in the middle of nowhere at this hour. But as he passed her, a strange thing happened. His radio, which had been silent the entire trip, crackled to life, static, followed by a whisper. Mark. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. His foot pressed down on the accelerator, and he sped forward, leaving the woman behind. The whispering stopped, but his pulse pounded in his ears. A few minutes passed, the road twisting through the fog, then movement ahead. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The woman was standing in the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the wet pavement. The tires screeched, but she didn't flinch. His headlights illuminated her fully now. Her skin was pale, too pale. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was wrong, too wide, too forced, as if she had forgotten how to mimic human expression. Mark's stomach twisted. He yanked the wheel and swerved around her, barely missing her by inches. As he sped past, he glanced in the rearview mirror. She was gone. Mark's breathing was ragged. His hands trembled against the wheel. He had to be imagining this. Maybe the exhaustion was getting to him. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus on the road ahead. A few miles later, he spotted something through the fog. A gas station. Relief flooded through him. He pulled in quickly, killing the engine. The neon open sign flickered above the door, but as he stepped out, something felt off. The air was unnaturally still. No wind, no crickets, no sound at all. He walked toward the entrance, but as he peered through the glass, his breath caught. The inside of the gas station was wrong. The shelves were stocked with products from decades ago. Dusty cans of food, glass soda bottles with labels he didn't recognize. The cash register was an old, rusted model. The entire place looked frozen in time. Then he saw the attendant. A man stood behind the counter, perfectly still. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken. He didn't blink, didn't breathe. Mark swallowed hard. "Hey," he called out, his voice shaking. "Can I use your phone?" The man didn't respond. Mark stepped closer. That's when he noticed something that made his blood turn to ice. The man wasn't standing behind the counter. He was hovering, a full inch above the ground. Mark stumbled back, his stomach lurching. Then the lights flickered, and the gas station was gone. Mark found himself standing in the middle of the empty road. No building, no car, just endless darkness. His heart pounded in his chest. A whisper crawled through the fog. "Mark." He turned slowly, every muscle in his body screaming at him to run. The woman stood just a few feet away. Her dark hair still covered most of her face, but now he could see her eyes. Hollow, black, endless. She took a step toward him. Mark turned and ran. His legs burned as he sprinted down the road, but no matter how far he went, the road never changed. No signs, no turns, just darkness and fog. Then the sound of footsteps behind him, slow at first, then faster, closer. He didn't dare look back. The whispers surrounded him now, growing louder, overlapping voices calling his name, laughing, whispering secrets that made his skin crawl. Then silence. He stopped. His lungs burned. His body shook. The road ahead had disappeared, just an endless stretch of blackness, a dead end. He turned around. The woman was right there, her face inches from his, her lips curled into that impossible smile. "You can't leave," she whispered. Darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, a truck driver spotted an abandoned car on the side of the highway. The doors were unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition. But there was no sign of Mark. The authorities searched the area but found nothing, just a single set of footprints leading away from the car and vanishing into the fog. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The night was eerily quiet as Ryan drove down the lonely highway, the dark road stretching endlessly before him. The hum of his car's engine was the only sound breaking the silence. He checked the time, 2:37 a.m. He was exhausted, his eyelids heavy, but home was still at least 2 hours away. He had just finished visiting his parents in their small hometown and had decided, unwisely, to make the long drive back in the middle of the night. The highway was nearly deserted, just the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance from a passing car. Trees lined both sides of the road, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The further he drove, the thicker the fog became, rolling in like ghostly tendrils stretching across the pavement. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, trying to stay alert. He had always found long drives at night peaceful, but something about tonight felt off. He couldn't place it. A strange unease sat in his gut, a sense that he wasn't truly alone out here. His thoughts were interrupted when he saw something up ahead. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible through the mist. But as he got closer, his headlights illuminated a figure standing by the roadside. A woman. She was barefoot in a long, flowing white nightgown, her dark hair cascading over her face. She stood unnaturally still, her head tilted slightly to the side. Ryan's heart thudded in his chest. He slowed the car as he approached. She wasn't hitchhiking. She wasn't moving at all. She just stood there, staring into the void of the night. Something about her made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He knew he should keep driving, but his foot instinctively pressed the brake. He rolled the window down slightly, just enough to call out, "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need help?" Silence. His pulse quickened. The woman didn't react. Then slowly she lifted her head. Her face was pale, almost too pale, like she had been drained of all blood. Her lips were cracked, dry. But it was her eyes that sent a chill through Ryan's body. Solid black, like two empty voids staring straight into his soul. Ryan's breath hitched. Then she smiled. It was a grotesque, unnatural grin that stretched too wide across her face. Ryan felt a primal fear seize him, as a deep, instinctual terror he couldn't explain. Without thinking, he yanked his foot off the brake and slammed on the gas. The car lurched forward, speeding past the woman as fast as he could go. His heart pounded violently in his chest. He didn't look back. He didn't want to. For miles, he drove in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He forced himself to take deep breaths, convincing himself it had just been some lost traveler or someone playing a cruel prank. But then the whispering started. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible, like the wind slipping through the cracks of the car. Then it grew louder. Ryan stiffened. The sound was inside the car, a slow, rhythmic whisper, like a voice just behind his ear. He didn't want to look. He couldn't look. But something made him glance at the rearview mirror. And that's when he saw her. She was sitting in his back seat, the woman from the road, her black eyes locked onto his through the mirror, her lips still curled into that impossible smile. Ryan let out a strangled cry, his hands shaking as he struggled to keep control of the car. He swerved wildly, barely managing to stay on the road. She tilted her head, as if amused by his terror. Then, in a voice that made his blood run cold, she whispered, "You should have stopped." Ryan slammed the brakes. The car screeched to a violent halt, tires skidding against the asphalt. He gasped for air, his heart hammering like a drum in his chest. Slowly, trembling, he turned around. The back seat was empty. Sweat dripped down his forehead. He clenched his jaw, trying to slow his breathing. Maybe he was hallucinating. Maybe it was the exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But then, a soft tapping on the window. His blood froze. The tapping was slow, deliberate. Ryan turned his head, his stomach twisting in pure horror. She was right outside his window, staring in at him, her black eyes gleaming in the darkness. His breath hitched. She raised her hand and pressed her palm against the glass, her fingers leaving behind smears of something dark. Ryan didn't wait. He threw the car into drive and sped off. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep control. He needed to get out of here. He needed to find a town, a gas station, anything. But the road stretched endlessly before him. No signs, no turns, just the same eerie, fog-covered highway. Then he saw the sign. "Welcome to Black Hollow." His stomach dropped. He had passed that sign 20 minutes ago. His blood ran cold. He was driving in circles. Ryan's breathing grew ragged. He gritted his teeth, trying to focus, trying to think logically. But before he could make sense of it, his headlights caught something in the distance. A figure standing by the side of the road. Ryan's heart stopped. It was her, the same woman in the same nightgown, her head still tilted, waiting. He let out a strangled gasp, slamming his foot on the gas. The car roared forward, barreling toward her at full speed. But just as he was about to hit her, she vanished. Gone. Ryan barely managed to swerve in time, his car skidding wildly before finally coming to a stop. His breathing was ragged, sweat dripping down his face. Then, from the back seat, a breath, slow, shallow, right behind him. Ryan felt a presence looming over him. Cold fingers touched the back of his neck. He screamed. Everything went black. Ryan woke up to the sound of knocking. His eyes fluttered open, his head pounding. Blinking against the sunlight, he realized he was still in his car, parked outside a small diner. A man in a security uniform stood outside his window, knocking again. "You all right, son?" the man asked. Ryan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Where am I?" The security guard frowned. "You're in Black Hollow. You've been sitting here for a few hours. You sure you're okay?" Ryan's body went rigid. Black Hollow. He had been driving all night. How did he get here? His hands trembled as he turned to look in the back seat. Empty. No sign of her. But as he reached for the ignition, his fingers brushed against something cold and wet. His breath caught in his throat. A handprint. A dark, smeared handprint on the back of his seat. His heart pounded. He looked at the guard, forcing a shaky breath. "I'm fine," he lied. The guard nodded and walked. Ryan started the car, gripping the wheel tightly. He didn't know what had happened last night, but he knew one thing for certain. She had been real, and she had let him go. For now. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The rain had started pouring down as James drove through the winding, remote roads just outside of the small town he called home. He had stayed at the office too long, caught in a sea of paperwork, and by the time he left, it was already dark. The thunder rumbled in the distance, adding an eerie tone to the otherwise peaceful evening. The headlights of his car sliced through the thick fog that had settled on the road, but every now and then, the darkness would engulf him, only for the beams to return just as quickly. He was almost home. Just a few more miles, and he could finally settle down for the night. But something felt wrong. The further he drove, the thicker the fog seemed to get. He turned the radio dial, trying to distract himself, but the airwaves were empty, static crackling through the speakers, as though he had driven out of range of any signal. As the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, James could barely make out the outlines of the trees lining both sides. His headlights reflected off something up ahead. A figure. It was standing by the side of the road, motionless. A person, perhaps in distress, just waiting to be seen. At first, James debated driving past. He had heard stories, the kind that would warn anyone against picking up strangers on dark roads, especially at night, but he couldn't shake the feeling of concern that washed over him. Maybe it was just instinct, or maybe it was the vulnerability of the situation, but he couldn't ignore it. He slowed the car and rolled down the window. "Hey," James called out, trying to be heard over the storm. "Do you need a ride?" The figure didn't respond. James squinted through the rain, trying to get a better look. The person seemed to be a woman, maybe in her mid-30s, her dark hair wet from the downpour, clinging to her face. She wore a long coat, but it was hard to tell more. Her face was partially obscured by the hood she had pulled up. James hesitated, waiting for any response, but the silence stretched on. He was about to roll the window back up when the figure took a step forward, a sudden movement that made James jump. The woman slowly raised her head, and James could see her face clearly now. Her skin was pale, almost sickly, and her lips were chapped. Her eyes, however, were what made his breath catch. They weren't quite human. They were wide, dark, and empty, like two deep pits where no light could escape. For a moment the air seemed to freeze. He couldn't explain why, but something deep inside him told him to drive away, to leave her there and forget he had ever seen her. But before he could act, the woman spoke, her voice soft but clear, carried easily through the rain. "Please," she said, "I need your help." Her tone was eerily calm, and though it held a certain sadness, there was a strange emptiness to it that made James uncomfortable. He took a deep breath. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Where are you trying to go?" The woman didn't answer right away. She simply stood there, staring at him. The longer he looked at her, the more his unease grew. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the sound of the rain and thunder. The air felt too still, too heavy. "Please," she repeated, her voice slightly more desperate now. "I need to get home." James looked around. There was nothing familiar about this place. No streetlights, no buildings, just trees and endless stretches of road. He didn't know where she was asking to go, but he couldn't just leave her out here. "I'll give you a ride to the nearest town," he said finally. "Just hop in." The woman's eyes seemed to soften slightly, and she nodded. Without saying a word, she opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. James felt a rush of cold air wash over him as she closed the door. He glanced over at her. She was sitting still, her hands folded in her lap, her head tilted slightly down. James tried to make small talk, anything to break the tension, but the woman didn't speak. It was almost as if she wasn't aware of his presence, as though her mind was elsewhere. The silence grew heavier, suffocating, and James found himself glancing over at her every few moments. Her unblinking eyes were fixed on the road ahead. "Where exactly are you trying to go?" James finally asked, breaking the silence once again. The woman's voice came low and hollow. "Home." "Where's home?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation going. She didn't answer. The road ahead was now almost entirely obscured by fog. James felt the weight of the silence pressing on him, the strange stillness in the air making everything seem unnatural. There was something wrong, something in her eyes and the way she was sitting so rigidly that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The woman shifted in her seat, a subtle movement, and for the first time she looked directly at him. "Turn left," she said suddenly. James felt a chill creep up his spine. "What?" "Turn left," she repeated, her voice colder now, more insistent. "You need to turn left." The road ahead was barely visible through the fog. James tried to peer into the thick mist, but could see nothing. He knew he couldn't afford to keep driving into it without any sense of direction. "Look, I don't know what you—" he began, but he was cut off when the woman's hand shot out and placed itself on his arm, her fingers icy cold against his skin. "Turn left," she repeated, her voice growing sharper, more commanding. Without thinking, James veered left, his heart racing. He couldn't explain why he did it, but it felt as though something beyond his control had taken over. The road now seemed even more desolate, narrowing as they drove deeper into the forest. He could no longer see the lights from the town in the distance, only the oppressive darkness. The woman sat motionless beside him, her eyes never leaving the road ahead. It was as though she was guiding him, pulling him along with some invisible force. James felt his grip on the steering wheel tighten. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice strained. He didn't know why, but he had to know. "Home," the woman replied again, her voice distant. "You'll see." The trees on either side seemed to close in as they drove further, the road now more of a barely visible path. His headlights illuminated the way ahead, but it felt as though the fog was swallowing them whole, creeping in around the edges of the car. It was impossible to know how far they had gone. And then out of nowhere, the woman spoke again. "Stop!" James slammed on the brakes, the car screeching as it slid to a halt. The fog had become so thick now that he could barely see the road in front of him. He was disoriented, and for the first time he felt a knot of fear twist in his stomach. Where are we?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she turned to him and said softly, "You shouldn't have stopped." Before James could respond, the air inside the car turned freezing cold. His breath came out in visible puffs, despite the warmth of the car's heater. He shivered, suddenly aware of how utterly alone they were in the middle of nowhere. The silence was suffocating, but it was the unsettling quiet of the forest that truly unnerved him. And then he saw something through the windshield, a figure, standing in the distance, just outside the reach of his headlights. A shadow, tall and thin, its shape barely visible through the thick fog. A low, bone-chilling laugh echoed from somewhere in the darkness. Suddenly the woman's voice rang out in the car, too loud, too urgent. "Drive now! Don't look back!" Before James could react, the car's engine sputtered. The lights flickered, then went out. In that instant, everything went black. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was a late October evening when I decided to spend the night at my grandparents' old house. I had always been drawn to it, mostly because of its history. The house was over 100 years old, nestled on the outskirts of a small town, and it had been passed down through generations. To me, it was more than just a home. It was a place that held the stories of my ancestors, the ghosts of their pasts. My grandmother had passed away years ago, and the house was now just a relic of her memory. It had been left mostly untouched, but my grandfather still lived there, though he was rarely home. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. It was just a night in the quiet house. I figured I'd spend the evening reminiscing, looking through old family photos, and perhaps feeling nostalgic. But that night was different. I arrived at dusk when the air was thick with fog and the scent of autumn leaves filled the air. The house looked the same as it had always had, weathered and worn, but comforting in its familiarity. The front porch creaked underfoot as I walked up to the door. I fumbled with the keys for a moment before unlocking the door, the rusty hinges groaning as it swung open. The house was cold inside, even though the thermostat was set to a comfortable temperature. The living room was dim, the only light coming from the small lamp beside the couch. I set my bag down and walked through the old house, running my fingers along the railings of the stairs and tracing the edges of the worn wooden floorboards. I loved this place. Despite the wear and tear, there was something about it that felt like home. I spent the first few hours unpacking and putting things in order. I found my grandmother's old rocking chair in the corner of the living room, the fabric faded and threadbare, but still sturdy. I couldn't help but sit in it for a moment, the chair creaking under my weight as I gently rocked back and forth. My grandmother used to sit in it for hours, knitting and telling stories. I could almost hear her voice in the stillness of the room, as if she were still there. It was when I decided to go upstairs that things began to feel off. The staircase creaked as I ascended, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. I paused at the top, staring down the long hallway. The air felt thick, and the quiet was suffocating. I walked down the hall toward the guest bedroom, where I had always stayed when I visited. The door was slightly ajar, and the soft light from downstairs filtered in, casting a dim glow on the floor. I pushed the door open, and as I stepped inside, a chill ran through me. The room felt different. The air was heavier, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. I chalked it up to the house's age and the fact that I hadn't been there in years. But there was something else, a presence, a feeling that I wasn't alone. I set my bag down on the bed and began to unpack, but the unsettling feeling didn't fade. Every time I turned around, I felt as if someone was watching me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling, the old beams and walls shifting with the wind. I decided to go back downstairs, thinking a warm cup of tea might settle my nerves. But as I turned to leave the room, I heard it. A soft, barely audible whisper coming from somewhere in the hallway. I froze. It wasn't just the wind or the house creaking. I could hear distinct words, too quiet to make out, but unmistakably there. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart began to race. I slowly turned around, my eyes scanning the empty hallway. Nothing. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only silence. I waited for a few moments, my breath shallow. There was no one there. No one except for me. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was nearby. I quickly made my way downstairs, determined to shake off the unease I was feeling. The living room seemed just as it had been when I had left, still and quiet. But as I walked past the old fireplace, I caught something in the corner of my eye. A shadow. I turned sharply, my pulse quickening, but there was nothing there. Just the dim glow of the lamp and the empty room. My eyes lingered on the shadow for a moment longer, but it didn't move. I sighed and sat down in the armchair by the fire, trying to calm myself. I had to be imagining things. It was an old house, after all, and I had been alone for hours. The evening passed without incident, and I eventually retired to the guest room to sleep. I turned off the lights, pulled the blankets over me, and closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. The house seemed too quiet. I could hear the wind howling outside, the trees scraping against the windows, and in the stillness of the room I began to hear it again. The whispering. At first it was faint, just a murmur in the distance. But as I lay there, my eyes wide open in the darkness, the whispers grew louder. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded so close, so much closer than before. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were coming from inside the room. I quickly turned on the light, flooding the room with brightness. The whispers stopped. I looked around, my breath coming in short gasps. There was no one there. The room was empty, just as it had been when I had first entered. But as my eyes traveled to the corner of the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The rocking chair. It was rocking. Slowly, back and forth. I could hear the creaking of the old wood, the soft scrape of the seat against the floor, but there was no one in the chair. No one to be causing it to move. I didn't know what to do. My body felt frozen in place, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The house felt alive, the walls pressing in around me as the shadows seemed to move. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, dialing my grandfather's number in a frantic rush. The phone rang several times before he picked up. Hello? Grandpa, I don't know what's happening, I said, my voice shaking. Something's wrong with the house. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Are you in the guest room? He asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Yes, I replied, my eyes never leaving the chair. The rocking had stopped, but the air in the room was thick with tension. I need you to listen to me, he said, his tone suddenly serious. There's something in that house, something that doesn't want you there. I could hear his breath crackling through the phone, a faint rustling in the background. My stomach dropped. Grandpa, what are you talking about? What do you mean? It's been in the family for generations, he said, his voice barely a whisper now. A presence, something that has always been there. It waits, it watches, it's been waiting for you. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat there in the dark, holding the phone in my trembling hands. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, but I was too scared to even move. The air felt suffocating, like the house was closing in on me. And then, in the silence, I heard it again. The whispering. This time, it was unmistakable. The words were clear. Come to me. I turned slowly toward the corner of the room where the rocking chair had been. And there, standing in the darkness, was a figure. It was tall, its features indistinct, as if it was cloaked in shadows. But its eyes, those eyes were burning, glowing in the dark like twin embers. I couldn't look away. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The whispers stopped. The house was silent. I didn't wait another second. I grabbed my things, ran out of the room, and didn't stop until I was outside in the cool night air. I never went back into that house again. It's been years now, and I still don't understand what happened that night. But I know one thing for sure. There was something in that house, and whatever it was, it's still there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 10.
It was just past midnight when I pulled into the dimly lit parking lot of the old rundown gas station on the outskirts of town. The night was heavy, thick with humidity, the air sticky with the promise of rain, though the storm hadn't yet broken. I had been driving for hours, the lonely stretch of highway winding and bending before me like a ribbon of asphalt that never seemed to end. I was tired, my eyelids heavy, but I needed gas, and this was the only station for miles. The station looked abandoned at first glance, its neon sign flickering faintly in the darkness, the large, cracked windows casting a dull, yellow glow. The gas pumps were old, their metal surfaces rusted, and the parking lot was nearly empty. I could barely make out the outline of a sedan parked near the pumps, the faint silhouette of a figure moving slowly around it. I sighed and pulled up to the pump nearest the station, hoping for a quick stop. As I stepped out of my car, I glanced toward the store. The door was slightly ajar, but the interior was too dark to make out anything clearly. No one was in sight, but the soft hum of the fluorescent lights inside made it seem as though the station was still in use. A soft bell jingled above the door as I stepped inside, and the stale, cold air hit me. It wasn't the usual coolness of an air-conditioned convenience store. This felt different, more like the kind of chill you get when a place hasn't seen visitors in a while. I took a deep breath, the smell of old coffee and mildew lingering in the air. The shelves were half empty, the snack aisles mostly bare, with a few bags of chips and boxes of crackers. The cash register was an old, bulky model, its display faintly glowing in the dimness. The man behind the counter looked up as I entered, and I could tell immediately that something was wrong. His face was gaunt, pale, and his eyes seemed distant, like he wasn't quite aware of where he was or who was standing in front of him. He didn't greet me, just gave me a slow, almost mechanical nod as he turned back to whatever he had been doing behind the counter. Just need to fill up, I said, trying to break the silence, my voice sounding too loud in the empty space. The man didn't respond, but he turned his head slightly and motioned toward the pumps with a lazy flick of his hand. I felt a twinge of unease creep up my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just tired or bored or didn't feel like talking. I wasn't in the mood for conversation anyway. I went back out to the car, filled the tank, and returned inside to pay. The man still hadn't moved, still seemed to be lost in thought. I reached for my wallet, but as I pulled out my credit card, I noticed something strange, a flicker in the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just the dim lighting playing tricks on me, but then I saw it again, something moving in the far corner of the store. A shadow. It was quick, too quick to be anything human, and it darted just out of my line of sight, vanishing into the dark aisles. I blinked and looked again, but the store was empty. The man behind the counter hadn't noticed anything, and I didn't know if I should even say anything. I felt a chill creeping up my neck and a knot forming in my stomach. I forced myself to pay, my fingers trembling as I handed over the card to the strange man, who took it without a word. As I was about to leave, the man spoke. His voice was a raspy whisper, barely audible. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his eyes never leaving the counter. "It's not safe." I froze, my hands still on the door handle. "What do you mean?" I asked, unsure whether I should even engage with him. But the man didn't answer. He just sat there, his hollow eyes staring at nothing in particular. I pushed the door open and stepped outside, my car keys digging into the palm of my hand as I walked back toward my car. The feeling of unease hadn't left me. If anything, it had only intensified. The sedan at the pump was gone, and I was alone in the parking lot. As I got into my car and started the engine, I glanced back toward the station. The man was still standing in the doorway, watching me. I drove away, the tires of my car humming on the wet pavement, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight. The road ahead stretched on for miles, and the headlights illuminated the empty highway, the trees along the sides swaying slightly in the breeze. My mind wandered as I tried to forget the strange encounter. But then, something caught my eye. A shadow. It moved just outside the corner of my vision. I glanced quickly in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. Just the road, the trees, the endless stretch of darkness. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I kept driving, telling myself I was just imagining things, that the strange man at the gas station had been nothing more than a tired old clerk who'd been working alone too long. But then the shadow appeared again. This time, it wasn't in my peripheral vision. It was right behind me, hovering just outside the glow of my rearview mirror. I slammed my foot on the gas, my heart racing. But the shadow followed, drifting just behind me, always out of reach, always there. I could feel it, closing in, pressing in on me. And then, just as I was beginning to panic, the road before me began to change. The familiar stretch of asphalt morphed into a darker, narrower road, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to press closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of whispers filled the car, as though something was speaking just beyond the window. I tried to slow down, but my car refused to stop. The steering wheel jerked in my hands, pulling me faster down the winding path. The whispers grew louder, their voices indistinct but filled with an unsettling urgency. I slammed on the brakes, but the car kept moving, dragging me forward, toward the darkness. Ahead, the road twisted and turned, and in the distance, I saw something. A figure standing in the middle of the road, its face hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but the figure seemed to be waiting for me. I tried to swerve, but the car wouldn't respond. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I careened toward the figure, helpless to stop myself. But just as I was about to hit it, the figure stepped aside. The car flew past, and I heard a soft, hollow laugh in my ear. I turned quickly, but there was no one in the car with me. The road before me began to blur, the trees becoming a swirling mass of darkness. My heart was racing in my chest, and I slammed my foot on the gas, but the car only sped up, faster and faster, as though something was dragging it forward. I don't know how long it lasted, but eventually, I found myself back on a familiar road, the highway, the lights of the town visible in the distance. My hands were shaking, my breath shallow, as I pulled the car to the side of the road. I sat there, the engine idling, the darkness around me suffocating. I didn't know what had happened, didn't know how I'd gotten here. All I knew was that something was wrong, something had followed me, and I had barely escaped. I didn't go back to the gas station. I never would. When I told people what had happened, they all dismissed it as exhaustion or my mind playing tricks on me. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. And that feeling, the one that settled deep in my bones, it's never really gone away. Every time I drive along that highway, I can't help but look over my shoulder, just in case something is still following me, waiting for the right moment to come back. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The wind howled through the skeletal trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Nathan tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his tired eyes flicking toward the dashboard clock. 2:37 a.m. He had been driving for nearly 4 hours, his only company the low hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of trees outside. The road stretched endlessly before him, a lonely ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dense forest. He had taken this route dozens of times before, but tonight something felt different. The darkness seemed heavier, the silence deeper. His phone sat on the passenger seat, its screen dark, no signal. It had been that way for miles. He wasn't worried. Not yet. He had grown up in these parts. He knew that the roads, though desolate, eventually led somewhere. Then he saw it, a figure on the side of the road. At first he thought it was a trick of the headlights, just shadows shifting through the fog. But as he got closer, he realized it was a woman. She stood motionless, her long white dress billowing in the wind. Her hair hung in dark, tangled strands over her face, obscuring her features. She wasn't waving for help, wasn't moving at all. Nathan's stomach twisted. He slowed the car but didn't stop. He had heard too many stories, seen enough horror movies to know that picking up a lone figure on an empty road at night never ended well. But as he passed her, something strange happened. For a brief moment, his radio crackled with static. Then, over the interference, a whisper. Nathan. His name. The word barely registered before the sound cut off completely, leaving nothing but the rhythmic thump of his tires against the road. A cold shiver crawled down his spine. He pressed his foot on the gas, putting as much distance between himself and the woman as possible. His heart pounded, his breathing uneven. He checked the rearview mirror. She was gone. Nathan exhaled, forcing a nervous chuckle. His mind was playing tricks on him, that's all. He was exhausted, and exhaustion did strange things. He turned his focus back to the road. The headlights cut through the dense fog, revealing nothing but trees and asphalt. He tried to push the incident from his mind, tried to focus on the familiar landmarks that meant he was getting closer to home. Then, up ahead, the woman stood in the middle of the road. Nathan's blood turned to ice. There was no way. He had left her miles behind. There were no side roads, no paths through the woods. She couldn't have gotten ahead of him. And yet, there she was, unmoving, staring. Nathan slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched against the wet pavement, the car skidding before coming to a jerking stop just feet away from her. His breath came in ragged gasps as he gripped the wheel. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear it in his ears. She didn't move, didn't blink. The wind tugged at her dress, but her body remained still, as though she were rooted to the spot. Nathan's instincts screamed at him to drive, to get out of there. But his hands were frozen, his mind unable to process what was happening. Then she took a step forward, and another. Nathan's body jolted into action. He threw the car into reverse, his tires spinning as he backed away. But the moment he moved, so did she. With unnatural speed, she lunged toward the car. Nathan slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched as the car shot backward. He spun the wheel, swerving around her, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But as he passed, he caught a glimpse of her face through the passenger window. Empty black eyes. Skin stretched too tightly over hollow cheeks. A mouth that twisted into an unnatural smile. Nathan screamed. The car fishtailed as he straightened out, his heart pounding so violently it felt like it would burst. He didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. He just drove, faster than he ever had before. The trees blurred past him, the fog thickening, the road ahead twisted and turned, unfamiliar now. He should have reached the highway by now, should have seen signs for town. But there was nothing, just the endless road, just the dark. Then, a whisper. Close. Inside the car. Nathan. His breath hitched, a slow, creeping dread coiled around him. He didn't want to look, didn't want to see. But his body betrayed him. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. She was in the back seat. Nathan's scream never fully formed. The car lurched as he lost control, tires skidding wildly. The world spun in a chaotic blur as the vehicle veered off the road. A sickening crunch of metal and glass erupted around him as he crashed through the trees. Then, silence. Nathan gasped. His body slumped against the steering wheel. His head throbbed, his vision blurred, blood dripped down his forehead, warm against his skin. For a moment he sat there, dazed, trying to force his mind to work. The windshield was shattered, branches and leaves tangled in the wreckage. He was alive, but something was wrong. The air was too still, the night too quiet, and then a breath, warm against his neck. Nathan froze. Slowly, trembling, he turned his head. She was there, sitting in the passenger seat, smiling. Her black eyes locked onto his, and she whispered, "You can't leave." Darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, a passing truck driver spotted the wreckage on the side of the road. The car was totaled, its frame twisted around a tree. The windshield shattered, the front completely crumpled from the impact. The authorities arrived within the hour, searching the area, combing through the wreckage, but Nathan was never found. The driver's seat was empty. The only sign of him was the blood on the steering wheel and the faint indentation in the passenger seat, as though someone had been sitting there. Waiting. Story the end.
Story number 12.
It was a crisp autumn night when James found himself driving down a desolate road, the kind where the only illumination came from the pale moonlight and his flickering headlights. He had been traveling for hours, heading back to his hometown after years of avoiding it. His mother had passed away recently, and the house he had once called home was now his to claim or sell. He had no intention of staying long. The house carried too many memories, most of them unpleasant. His childhood had been steeped in loneliness, overshadowed by whispers in the halls, cold spots in his room, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. His mother had always dismissed his fears, but James had never shaken the feeling that something unnatural resided within those walls. The road wound through the dense forest, leaves rustling ominously in the cold breeze. His phone had lost service miles ago, and the gas station he had planned to stop at had been closed. He was running on fumes, both in the tank and in his own exhausted mind. As he approached the town limits, a deep fog rolled in, thick and unnatural. His high beams barely penetrated the dense mist, and his grip on the wheel tightened. A shadow darted across the road. James slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching against the damp pavement. His heart pounded as he scanned the road ahead, but there was nothing. Just the fog swirling like ghostly tendrils around his car. His breathing was ragged as he sat still for a moment, trying to calm himself. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," he muttered, shaking his head. He continued driving, though unease curled around him like a cold hand. The house was only a few miles away now. He hadn't seen it in over a decade, and yet, as soon as he pulled into the long gravel driveway, he felt a shiver run down his spine. The Victorian house loomed before him, its dark windows like soulless eyes staring into the night. The porch creaked in protest as he stepped onto it, and when he pushed open the front door, a wave of musty air and decay washed over him. The house had been left untouched since his mother's passing. Dust covered every surface, cobwebs clung to the corners, and the air carried a stagnant stillness. James flipped the light switch, but the electricity had long been cut. He sighed, retrieving the flashlight from his bag. As he moved through the halls, memories clawed at him. The laughter of his childhood, overshadowed by nights spent hiding under his blanket, too afraid to sleep. The whispers in the dark, the cold breath on his neck when no one was there. He had convinced himself, growing up, that it had been his imagination. But now, standing in the dim light of his flashlight, he wasn't so sure. A floorboard creaked behind him. He spun around, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. His breath hitched, and he let out a nervous chuckle. "It's just an old house settling," he told himself. Still, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. He made his way upstairs, hesitant but determined. His mother's room was at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. He pushed it open, revealing a room frozen in time. The bed was still made, the scent of her lavender perfume barely lingering in the stale air. Something moved in the corner of his vision. He turned abruptly, his flashlight trembling in his grasp. A tall mirror stood against the wall, its surface covered in dust. But beneath the grime, He swore he saw movement, something shifting within the reflection. He stepped closer, his pulse thundering in his ears. He wiped away a section of the glass with his sleeve, revealing his own reflection. But it wasn't alone. Behind him, standing in the doorway, was a shadowy figure. James gasped, spinning around, but the hallway was empty. He whipped back to the mirror, his own reflection now the only thing staring back. His chest rose and fell with rapid breaths. He needed to get out of there. He turned, making his way back down the stairs, his pace quickening with each step. But as he reached the bottom, the front door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. A cold gust of air rushed past him, and with it came a voice, a whisper that slithered into his ear. "You never should have come back." James bolted for the door, yanking at the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The whisper turned into a low, guttural growl, and the air around him grew heavy, suffocating. Footsteps echoed down the stairs. He spun around, his flashlight flickering. Shadows slithered along the walls, stretching and contorting unnaturally. And then he saw it. A figure, tall and emaciated, its limbs too long, its face obscured by darkness. It stood on the staircase, its hollow eyes locked onto him. James stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt an invisible force pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe. Then, in a voice that was both familiar and foreign, it whispered, "You left me here." Recognition struck him like ice in his veins. The voice, it was his own. Memories he had long buried clawed their way to the surface. The childhood nightmares, the voice that had spoken to him from the shadows, the presence he had always felt but never seen. He had thought he had imagined it all, but it had been real, and it had been waiting for him. With a desperate cry, James lunged for the window, shattering the glass as he threw himself through it. He hit the ground hard, pain lancing through his side, but he didn't stop. He scrambled to his feet, running towards his car, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He jumped in, turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Without looking back, he peeled out of the driveway, gravel flying beneath his tires. As he sped away, he chanced one last glance in the rearview mirror. The house stood still, silent and looming. But in the upstairs window, where his mother's room had been, he saw a figure watching him. Not the shadowy creature, but himself. A pale, twisted version of his own reflection, smiling. Story the end.
Story number 13.
The rain had been falling steadily for hours, turning the winding back roads into a slick, treacherous path. Daniel cursed under his breath as his tires skidded slightly on the wet asphalt. It was past midnight, and he had no business being out this late, let alone on an unfamiliar road in the middle of nowhere. But work had sent him on an assignment to a small town upstate, and he had lost track of time while packing up the last of his equipment. His GPS had died an hour ago, and his phone had no signal. The only thing guiding him was the dim glow of his headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. He was certain he had taken a wrong turn somewhere, but there were no signs, no houses, nothing, just trees lining both sides of the road, their branches swaying violently in the wind. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. A figure standing on the side of the road. A woman. She was barely visible through the downpour, her pale dress soaked and clinging to her frame. She wasn't waving for help or moving, just standing there, motionless. Daniel's grip tightened on the wheel. He debated stopping, but something about her sent a cold shiver through him. Who would be out here at this hour, in this weather? Maybe she had been in an accident. Maybe she needed help. He slowed the car as he passed her, rolling down his window just enough to call out. "Hey, do you need help?" The woman turned her head slightly, her face obscured by the wet strands of her dark hair. She took a slow step forward, and Daniel felt an inexplicable wave of dread crash over him. Then, without warning, the radio in his car crackled to life. Static. Garbled voices, whispering just below the noise. Daniel's pulse spiked. He fumbled to turn the radio off, but the dial wouldn't move. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, a cacophony of words he couldn't understand. And then, through the static, he heard his name. Daniel! He jerked his head up. The woman was gone. His breath hitched. He scanned the road, his hands clammy against the wheel. She couldn't have just vanished, but she was nowhere to be seen. Not in the trees, not in the rearview mirror. A sickening feeling settled in his stomach. Without another thought, he pressed his foot down on the gas. The road stretched endlessly ahead, with each mile feeling longer than the last. The rain didn't let up, and neither did his unease. His heart still pounded from whatever had just happened back there. He tried to reason with himself. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. Maybe the stress and exhaustion were catching up. Then, up ahead, he saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road. The same woman. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His grip on the steering wheel turned his knuckles white. This wasn't possible. He had driven miles since he last saw her. There was no way she could be ahead of him. His instincts screamed at him to keep driving, to not look at her, to get as far away as possible. But as he passed, his eyes betrayed him, flicking toward her just for a second. She was looking directly at him. Her face, pale, hollow, eyes sunken into dark sockets, was twisted into something that barely resembled human. Daniel gasped, jerking the wheel. The tires skidded, the car swerved violently, and he barely managed to regain control. He kept his foot on the gas, heart racing, breath ragged. The radio crackled again. Daniel! A voice, no, multiple voices, whispered his name over and over, distorting, overlapping, growing louder. He reached for the dial, trying to shut it off, but the moment his fingers touched it, a shrill burst of static erupted through the speakers. He winced, gripping his ears as the sound became deafening. And then, silence. The only sound was the rain. Daniel's breath came in uneven gasps. He kept driving, the road a blur beneath him. He needed to get out of here. He needed to find a town, a gas station, something. Then his headlights flickered. For a split second, darkness swallowed the road. And when they came back on, Sinatron. She was standing in the middle of the road. Daniel's scream barely escaped his throat as he yanked the wheel, the car skidding out of control. The world spun around him, headlights flashing through the rain as the car veered off the road and crashed into the trees. For a moment, there was nothing but ringing in his ears. Pain shot through his skull, and his vision blurred. His hands trembled as he unbuckled his seatbelt, forcing himself to breathe. He needed to get out. The windshield was cracked, but not shattered. The rain pounded against the glass, and the wind howled through the broken driver's side window. Blood dripped from a gash on his forehead. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching against the wet leaves outside his car. Daniel's breath hitched. He turned his head, his pulse pounding in his ears. Through the shattered window, he saw her. The woman. She stood just feet away, her soaked dress clinging to her emaciated frame, her hair hanging in wet tangles around her face. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Daniel tried to move, tried to push the door open, but his limbs wouldn't obey. Fear paralyzed him. Then suddenly she was gone. A whisper, impossibly close to his ear. Daniel. His heart stopped. He turned his head ever so slowly. She was inside the car, sitting in the passenger seat, her face inches from his. Her eyes, black voids, bore into him. Her mouth stretched open, wider than humanly possible, and the whisper turned into a shriek. Daniel's vision went black. When he woke, the rain had stopped. The first thing he noticed was the silence. No wind, no rustling trees, no sounds at all. His body ached as he shifted, looking around. His car was still wrecked, the engine dead, the headlights dimming, but there was no sign of her. Was it a dream, a hallucination from the crash? He reached for his phone, his hands still shaking. No signal. With great effort, he pushed the door open and stumbled onto the wet ground. The road was empty. The forest around him was eerily still. Then, in the distance, he saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching him. Daniel's breath came in short, panicked gasps. He turned, forcing his legs to move, stumbling away from the wreck. He needed to find help, needed to get away from this place. But as he took one last glance over his shoulder, the figure was closer. Story the end.
Story number 14.
It had been a long, grueling week. The kind that wears you down physically and mentally, leaving you feeling hollow by the time Friday night rolled around. My work was exhausting, filled with long hours and demanding clients. So when I finally got into my car to head home after the workday, I was ready for nothing more than some peace and quiet. I decided to take the back roads. I always preferred the solitude of the winding paths, especially when the sun began to set. The slow, rhythmic hum of the car on the quiet, untraveled road helped calm my nerves. I enjoyed the break from the city. No honking horns, no rushing people, just the open, empty road stretching out before me. The sky above me was a canvas of muted pinks and oranges as the sun dipped below the horizon. The last traces of daylight were quickly fading. It was nearly dark, and I was still miles away from my apartment, but I wasn't worried. I'd driven these roads countless times before. The road I was on was one of those older routes that cut through thick woods, past abandoned houses and neglected farms. The buildings, some crumbling, others swallowed by the overgrown trees and vines, had always intrigued me. There was something oddly peaceful about the isolation of it all, but at the same time, it stirred something within me, something darker, more unsettling. As I drove, my mind wandered. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just letting the silence of the car soothe me. But then I saw it, a flash of movement just off the side of the road. My eyes instinctively flicked to the rear view mirror, but there was nothing behind me, only the empty stretch of road. I brushed it off, attributing it to the fading light playing tricks on me. Maybe a deer or some other animal. But the sensation of being watched lingered. I shook my head, trying to dispel the creeping unease. It was probably just my imagination. After all, the woods were full of creatures, raccoons, foxes, deer, that could explain the movement. Nothing to worry about. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't just the flash of motion that had unsettled me. It was something deeper. A sense that there was something wrong, something out of place. I tried to focus on the road, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. I turned the radio on, hoping the familiar sound of music would ease the tension, but it only seemed to amplify the discomfort. That's when I saw it again. This time, the movement was slower, more deliberate. I slammed my foot on the brake, my heart skipping a beat. There, on the edge of the trees, I could see something, or someone standing in the shadows. It was hard to make out at first, the figure indistinct, blending into the darkness of the woods. But the closer I got, the clearer it became. A person. A woman. Her figure was slender and tall, but something about her posture was wrong. She wasn't standing like a normal person. It was as if she was bent, twisted in an unnatural way. Her head was tilted back at an odd angle, and she was staring up at the sky, her face obscured by the shadow of her hair. It didn't look like she was waiting for a car to pass by or even just standing idly. She seemed to be watching. I slowed the car, my instincts telling me to stop, to do something. But I wasn't sure what. The woman's strange stance made me feel uneasy, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. Something about her was drawing me in. My heart pounded in my chest as I rolled the window down slightly, trying to get a better look. The night air was cool, and I could hear the rustling of the trees around me, the soft hum of insects in the distance. Just as I was about to call out to her, to ask if she needed help, she moved. Her head snapped toward me with such speed that I could hear the crack of her neck twisting. A gasp caught in my throat. Her eyes, wide and empty, fixed on mine. There was no expression on her face, only those dark, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. Her lips moved slightly, but there was no sound. I couldn't breathe. I slammed my foot on the accelerator and shot forward, my heart racing as the car roared to life. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I had to get away, to put as much distance between me and that strange, twisted figure as possible. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and the road seemed to stretch on forever as I drove faster, faster. It wasn't until I reached the town, a small speck of civilization in the distance, that I finally slowed down. The adrenaline pumping through my veins made my hands feel clammy, and my breath was shallow, uneven. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, a dimly lit place off to the side of the road. The pump was old, the sign flickering weakly in the night, but I didn't care. I just needed to stop, to calm myself. I filled the tank, my hands still shaking, and when I stepped inside to pay, I found the attendant sitting behind the counter. He was an older man, graying hair and a tired face. His eyes flicked up to meet mine as I approached, but there was something off about his expression. "You all right?" he asked, his voice raspy, as if he had been awake for far too long. I nodded quickly, trying to shake off the lingering fear. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little jumpy." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze turning almost sympathetic. "You see something out there?" I froze. My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer right away, but he glanced toward the window, the one that looked out into the empty parking lot. "You saw something in the woods, didn't you?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. Yeah, I think so. The man nodded slowly, his face hardening. That's not the first time. Not the first time someone's seen her, the woman in the woods. I blinked, my mind racing. What are you talking about? He leaned forward, his hands resting on the counter, his voice quiet but steady. She's been there for years, in the woods, watching the road. People see her sometimes, especially around this time of night, but you never stop, never get too close. I felt a shiver run down my spine. What happens if you do? The man's eyes flickered to the door, and he lowered his voice even more. You don't want to know. I turned to leave, my pulse pounding in my ears, but as I reached for the door, the man spoke again, his voice now sharp and urgent. Don't go back down that road. Not tonight. Especially not tonight. I didn't stop to ask why. I couldn't. I just left, the door slamming behind me as I hurried back to my car. I didn't know why I was so terrified, but something about the man's tone told me not to ask questions. I had to get out of here. I had to leave this place behind. But as I drove away, I couldn't help but glance into the rearview mirror. And when I did, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The figure. The woman. She was standing by the side of the road again, her head tilted back in that same unnatural angle, her eyes locked onto mine, even though I was miles away. The same empty, hollow stare. I pressed my foot to the gas, the tires screeching as I accelerated into the night, desperate to put as much distance between me and the woods as I could. But I knew, deep down, that I would never escape her. Story the end.
Story number 15.
I had never believed in ghosts. I'd always dismissed the stories my friends told me, the tales of haunted houses, strange noises in the night, and eerie shadows that followed people around. To me, it was all just superstition. I was the type of person who wanted solid, logical explanations for everything, and that was how I lived my life. Practical, grounded, and skeptical. That all changed one night, and I have never been the same since. It happened a few years ago, when I was in my mid-20s, living in a small apartment just outside the city. It was an old building, one of those places where the walls were thin and the floors creaked when you walked. It wasn't a glamorous place by any means, but it was cheap and convenient. I didn't need anything fancy. It started as just a feeling. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. I would walk into my apartment after work, and something would feel off. The air would feel colder than usual. The silence almost oppressive. It wasn't like the building was haunted, at least not in any obvious way. There were no strange noises or things moving around, but there was this nagging feeling like I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. I told myself I was just imagining it. I chalked it up to stress and the fact that I'd been working long hours at the office. Maybe I was just tired. But then, one evening, things took a turn. I came home late from work, as usual, after grabbing dinner with a friend. The apartment felt unusually quiet, more so than normal. The light in the hallway was flickering, and I remember thinking how odd that was, since the bulb was relatively new. I brushed it off, assuming it was just a small electrical issue. I walked into the living room and set my things down on the coffee table. I flicked on the lights and went to the kitchen to grab a drink. As I was standing there, I heard something. A soft, barely audible noise coming from behind me. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, as if someone were walking across the wooden floors. I froze. I turned around quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The apartment was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky despite my best effort to sound calm. There was no response. I looked around the room. Nothing seemed out of place. I told myself it was probably the building settling or maybe the wind making strange noises through the cracks in the windows. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I went back to the living room and sat on the couch, trying to distract myself with a TV show. My mind kept drifting back to those footsteps. I tried to push it out of my head, but the unease wouldn't go away. The next few days were uneventful, but that feeling lingered. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, checking the corners of the room. The subtle noises, the flickering lights, it all felt like the house was watching me. It wasn't until about a week later that something happened that I couldn't explain. I had just gotten back from work, and it was late, around midnight or so. I had been working late and was exhausted, but as soon as I stepped into the apartment, I felt that familiar chill in the air. The silence was suffocating. I dropped my keys on the counter and went into the kitchen to get a glass of water. As I opened the cupboard, I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they were louder, more distinct, as if someone was walking across the floor behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around, and there, standing in the doorway of the living room, was a figure. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one, though the figure was blurred, like a faint shadow. She was tall, her hair long and flowing, but her features were too indistinct to make out. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, something from another time. The figure just stood there, motionless, staring at me with eyes that seemed to glow faintly, though I couldn't make them out clearly. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my glass. My breath caught in my throat, and I found myself unable to move. I blinked, hoping that maybe I was imagining it. But when I opened my eyes again, the figure was still there, standing perfectly still, as if she were waiting for something. In a panic, I turned and bolted for the door. My mind raced as I fumbled with the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked on it desperately, but it felt like it was locked from the inside, even though I knew I hadn't locked it when I came in. I turned around, and the figure was gone. But the air was still cold, and the silence had deepened, almost as if the entire apartment was holding its breath. I finally managed to get the door open and ran out into the hallway. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might collapse. I couldn't stop shaking. I stood in the hallway for a long time, trying to catch my breath, my mind spinning. What had just happened? Had I seen a ghost? Was I just hallucinating from exhaustion? I didn't know, but I couldn't go back in there. Not that night. I called my best friend, who lived a few blocks away, and told her I needed to stay at her place. She could tell something was wrong by the sound of my voice, and she insisted I come over immediately. I didn't return to my apartment for 3 days. When I finally did go back, I was hesitant. I had spent the last few days telling myself it was just my imagination, that maybe the exhaustion had caused me to see things. But as soon as I stepped into the apartment, I felt it. The cold air, the silence, the oppressive feeling that something was wrong. I went straight to the living room, determined to face whatever it was that had scared me the other night. The room was just as I had left it, the furniture undisturbed. I walked over to the coffee table, and that's when I saw it. There was something on the floor. A single black feather. I hadn't noticed it before. The room had been completely clear when I had left, but now, there it was. It looked out of place, like it had just appeared out of nowhere. I bent down to pick it up, but before I could touch it, I heard a whisper, a soft, barely audible voice coming from the corner of the room. Leave. I froze, the blood draining from my face. I looked around, but there was no one there. The apartment was still empty. The feather was the only thing in the room that shouldn't have been. I stood up slowly, backing away toward the door. The whisper came again, this time clearer, more insistent. Leave. Now. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran out of the apartment again, my heart hammering in my chest, and didn't return for the rest of the night. I stayed at a friend's place for the next few days, trying to shake the feeling that something was waiting for me in that apartment. I never stayed another night in that apartment. After that night, I moved out of the building, finding another place in a different part of town, but the experience never left me. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't want to, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had been in that apartment wasn't something I wanted to face again. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, soft and insistent, echoing through the empty halls of the place where I once lived, and I wonder if I'll ever truly be free of whatever was in that apartment. Story the end.
Story number 16.
I had been driving for hours. The highway stretched on endlessly before me, dark and isolated. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the empty road. The faint hum of the engine was the only sound that kept me company as I made my way toward the small town I had to pass through to reach my destination. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I decided to stop for gas. The station I pulled into was one of those old, weathered places that looked like it had been around for decades. The sign, cracked and flickering in the dim light, read, "Open 24 hours." There was no one else around, no other cars, just the station, sitting like a ghost in the middle of nowhere. I'd been on the road for so long, I didn't mind the isolation. I was used to it. But as I stepped out of my car and walked toward the pump, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The gas station was quiet, too quiet. No sounds of the usual small town life, no dogs barking, no passing cars, no laughter. Just silence, a stillness that seemed unnatural. As I approached the pumps, I noticed the attendant sitting behind the counter inside the store. He was a middle-aged man, disheveled, with unkempt hair and a weary expression. His eyes were hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days. I waved at him, and he gave me a half-hearted nod, his eyes never leaving the counter. I shrugged it off and began pumping my gas. As I worked, I glanced over at the store again. It looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The shelves inside were stocked with dusty cans of food, old candy bars, and faded bags of chips. The gas station was strange, but I needed to refuel, and I was tired. I didn't think much more of it until I saw him. A man walked into the store, a heavy coat draped over his shoulders, even though it wasn't cold outside. He was tall and thin, with a gaunt face and dark, hollow eyes. His hair was matted, and his clothes were worn, as though he had been traveling for days without rest. I didn't think anything of it at first, just another traveler, I assumed. But then something about him caught my attention. He didn't look like he belonged there. His eyes were too vacant, too cold. He moved with an unsettling grace, as if he wasn't really walking, but gliding across the floor. His face was expressionless, almost dead. It reminded me of a man who had seen too much, someone who had given up on the world. He approached the counter and stood there silently for a moment, staring at the attendant. The man behind the counter didn't react. He didn't acknowledge the newcomer. It was as if the two men existed in different realities, their worlds separated by an invisible barrier. The stranger spoke, his voice barely audible. "Do you know where it is?" The attendant didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the counter, his hands resting limply by his sides. The man spoke again, his voice sharper this time. "Where is it? You promised me." His words were interrupted by a sudden harsh cough, deep and rattling. He staggered slightly but regained his balance, still fixated on the attendant, who remained unresponsive. A chill ran down my spine as I watched the scene unfold. There was something unsettling about the way the man spoke, as if he wasn't just asking for directions but was searching for something, or someone. The man behind the counter seemed to flinch for the briefest of moments, but he didn't respond. Instead, he glanced toward the back of the store, his gaze vacant. For a moment, it seemed like he was looking at something behind the shelves. But when I looked, I saw nothing. The stranger's eyes flicked toward the same spot, and his face twisted into something resembling a smile, though it was more of a grimace, a tortured expression that didn't quite fit the situation. "I should have known better than to trust you," the man muttered, his voice low and dangerous. I couldn't take it anymore. Something about the whole scene made my skin crawl. I wanted to leave, but my car was already filled up. I walked back to the pump, trying to ignore the unsettling atmosphere in the store. But as I reached my car, I heard a noise, a soft scraping sound, like metal against metal coming from the back of the station. I froze. I looked toward the store. The door was slightly ajar now, and the strange man was standing just inside, his head tilted to one side, staring at me. His hollow eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. Something not human. My heart began to race as I climbed into my car. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I started the engine, but as I put the car in gear, I heard it again. This time it was louder. The scraping sound was followed by a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. I didn't look back. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and sped away, my heart pounding in my chest. The road ahead stretched out before me, and the further I drove, the more I tried to convince myself that I had just imagined everything. The weird man, the strange behavior, the scraping noise. It was all just a figment of my overactive imagination, right? But the feeling lingered. The unease gnawed at me, the chill in the air creeping into my bones. I couldn't shake the thought that something had followed me. As I drove further down the road, I started to notice the trees. They were different from the ones I had passed earlier. They seemed older, darker. The branches twisted and contorted in unnatural shapes, like they were reaching out for me. I glanced at the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond the tree line. It was too dark to make out any details, but I knew something was there. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that it was just the shadows playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, the presence of something following me, just out of sight. The further I drove, the more intense the feeling became. The trees grew denser, the road narrower, and the air grew colder as if I had crossed some invisible boundary. The whispers started then, low, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from all directions. I looked around, but there was no one. Just the road, the trees, and the dark. And then ahead of me, I saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart stopping in my chest. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't make out its face, but I knew it was staring at me. I tried to drive around it, but my car wouldn't move. It was as if the wheels were stuck in place, frozen by some invisible force. The figure didn't step aside. It simply stood there, unmoving, its presence suffocating the air. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and suddenly I felt a hand press against the back of my seat. I whipped around, but no one was there. The sensation lingered, cold and clammy, as if someone was watching me from just behind. I turned back to face the road, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The figure was gone. But the road was no longer the same. It had changed. The familiar trees were gone, replaced by twisted, dark silhouettes. The air was thick, stifling, and I could feel the temperature drop, my breath coming out in visible puffs. I wasn't on the same road anymore. I had no idea where I was. Panic set in. I tried to turn the car around, but it wouldn't respond. The engine sputtered and stalled, and no matter how many times I tried to restart it, nothing happened. The whispers grew louder still, and I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of footsteps. Slowly, deliberately, someone or something was walking toward my car. I turned to look, my heart racing, but the figure was still there, standing just outside my window, its face now inches from the glass. I could see it clearly now, its eyes, hollow and empty, staring straight through me. And then it smiled. The smile was too wide, too unnatural, and I felt a cold, paralyzing dread grip my heart. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I was trapped, unable to move, unable to escape. The figure leaned closer to the window, and in a voice that wasn't quite a whisper, it said, "You should never have come here." I didn't know what happened next. My mind shut down, and I lost consciousness. When I woke up, the sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the road. The air was no longer cold, and the trees had returned to their normal, peaceful state. I was on the same road, far from the gas station, but I didn't know how I had gotten there. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened, who would believe me, but I never passed that gas station again. The unease, the whispers, and the figure never left my mind. I still drive that road sometimes, but I always keep my eyes forward, never glancing at the trees, never looking back. Story the end.